Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Every year, the Palestinian Authority receives hundreds of millions of dollars from America, also from Israel and the European Union. For the past 4 years, no one exactly knows how that money is being spent.
Palestinian leaders will not release the information. The reason millions of dollars is likely being used to fund terrorism. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem on a watchdog group demanding answers.
Over the last few years, the Palestinian Authority has changed its financial reporting, and a leading watchdog group wants to know what it's trying to hide.
It used to publish, albeit limited, financial reportings on a monthly basis and an annual basis, but slowly but surely they've been cutting back the amount of publications that they put out.
After researching the issue, Maurice Hirsch of the Palestinian Media Watch found the PA hasn't published its annual budget in 4 years.
That means that no one really knows how the Palestinian Authority plans to use their money that they have coming in every year, international donor money, Israeli money that's coming in as a result of the Oslo Accords, and even their own money. Almost every country in the world publishes a budget. The Palestinian Authority, which is so dependent on international aid, doesn't publish its budget.
Hirsch says even published accounting information of what had been spent is now missing.
When you go onto the website of the Palestinian Ministry of Finance, there is no access to any financial details whatsoever.
CBN News repeatedly attempted to contact the Palestinian Authority, but was unable to get a response. Since its beginning in 1994, the international community has basically funded the Palestinian Authority. More than half of that money comes from Israel, mostly taxes collected from Palestinians working in the country. While the PA collects domestic taxes, the rest of its funding comes from the European Union and the United States.
The reason really that they're trying to hide their finances is that Palestinian Media Watch has repeatedly used the reports that they do publish in order to highlight the fact that they pay hundreds of millions of dollars in rewards to terrorists every single year.
That's why Congress passed the Taylor Force Act in 2018. Taylor Force was a U.S. military veteran murdered in a terror attack in Israel. His murderer was killed in the attack, and so his family receives a stipend because he was a terrorist. The Taylor Force Act doesn't allow the U.S. to give direct economic aid to the PA unless it stops paying stipends to terrorists and the families of dead terrorists.
There's just the aid which is going indirectly via U.S. aid for the benefit of the Palestinians.
USAID and the United Nations Relief Works Agency funding goes to infrastructure projects to schools and health clinics for the people. But that frees up other monies in the PA budget that could be used to pay terrorists.
What we've also shown is that the PA has been siphoning off almost $1 billion shekel, hundreds of millions of dollars, every year, at least for the last 3 years, to what they call the PLO institutions.
Hirsch says there's plenty the West can do to hold the Palestinian Authority accountable. He also says transferring money to institutions belonging to the PLO should be prohibited. He says these are elementary requirements that should be implemented quickly.
Rewarding terrorism does not promote peace. Siphoning off billions of dollars in order for these PLO institutions to, again, directly or indirectly finance, fund, promote terrorism does not promote peace.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, this obviously doesn't promote peace. What it does promote is incitement, and we've seen that just in the past few days, where a leader of Hamas in Gaza tells Palestinians to get their guns ready, to sharpen their axes and their knives. And in response, there's an axe attack, a murder of 3 fathers on the streets of Israel. All because of this, all because of an ideology of hatred. When you look at it, you just shake your head and go, how can you train your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren in this kind of hatred, where you turn them into murderers? And then when they become murderers, you reward them financially and you reward their families. It absolutely makes no sense. That's why our U.S. Congress passed the Taylor Force Act. Now it's up to our current administration to enforce it, to say, no, we're not going to fund terrorism. We're not going to fund the murder of Israelis. This has to stop. And I hope they have the backbone to do it. So far, they haven't shown that. They've put back into place things that under the Trump administration, funding for UNRWA, funding for the Palestinian Authority was withdrawn in accordance with the Taylor Force Act. But they've restored that. They've even said we want to put a consulate for the Palestinian Authority right in the heart of Jerusalem. Israel said, no, you're not going to do that in our capital city. So if you want to put a consulate into Ramallah, go ahead, but not here on our land. You're not going to do that. So this is one where you look at our policies and say, do our policies really intend to bring peace to the region, or do they intend to bring incitement and further terrorism? That's a question I think the administration needs to be asked repeatedly, because our tax dollars, are funding this. In other news, gas prices hit an all-time high today. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. From fuel to food, housing, prices are surging across the board. And on Wall Street, stocks took another major tumble to start the week. President Biden's scheduled White House address today focuses on the growing inflation crisis. CBN's Jenna Browder reports.
Americans are feeling it in the pocketbook, with gas prices at an all-time high and other basics like food spiking. The president knows it's a problem he needs to get out in front of in an election year. According to AAA, the national average for a gallon of regular is now $4.37, up 23 cents from last month and a new record high. Some analysts predict an average price as high as $4.50 a gallon by summer. And it's not just gas. According to the latest Consumer Price Index report, food at home prices have risen 10% in the last 12 months, marking the largest 12-month increase since 1981. Prices for meat and eggs increased more than 13% over the last year, while beef rose 16%. What's more, the USDA predicts grocery store prices will jump another 5 to 6% this year. And on Wall Street, stocks deepened their losses on Monday, sending the S&P 500 to its lowest close in more than a year.
The president will be speaking to his plan, his continued plan to continue the fight to address inflation in the coming months.
President Biden is expected to address the growing crisis today at the White House. The speech to highlight steps he's taken to help American consumers, like releasing oil from the strategic reserve, and contrasting it with Republican proposals. Even some Democrats, including President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers, say the Biden administration's big spending packages increase the surge in inflation. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki taking this pointed question from a reporter.
In retrospect, were they right that some of the government policies were going to lead to inflation?
I wouldn't say we agreed with them then, and we don't agree with them now.
CBN financial editor Drew Parkhill.
And Steve Ratner, who is also an Obama economic advisor, said this is Biden's inflation and he needs to own it. So their warnings came to pass, and now because of government spending, that's what made high inflation much higher.
That spells political trouble for the president and Democrats. A recent ABC News poll shows Americans trust Republicans over Democrats to handle inflation by a nearly 20-point margin.
Inflation is the #1 political issue because it affects everybody. The White House talks about job growth. Well, that's nice, but that may be somebody down the street. You, on the other hand, are going to the gas pump and you're seeing record gas prices. You're going to the grocery store. You're seeing high food prices. It affects the middle class. It affects people of lower incomes.
And President Biden's speech comes just one day before a key inflation report is released. One prominent analyst believes it will show the rate of inflation last month was below the 8.5% rate we saw in March, an indicator inflation may have finally peaked. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Jenna. Now to the Philippines, where the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos appears to have locked up the presidential election. With 97% of the ballots counted, Marcos won more than 30 million votes. The closest contender, the current vice president, has about 15 million. Boxing legend and Christian Senator Manny Pacquiao has the third highest total with 3.5 million. Protesters marched in Manila denouncing the unofficial results. One leader said they're outraged over a political system that would allow the heir of an exiled dictator to become president. Gordon, for those who aren't familiar, do you think those concerns are warranted?
Well, we're looking at a complicated election system, and there have been many people within the Philippines that remember the Marcos years with fondness. I don't understand that, but you say, okay, if that's there. The issue is just popularity and name recognition, and the Philippine political system is remarkably complicated. And it's one that you have to be on the inside to really understand it. So how do the quote, ruling families, close quote, continue to get reelected, continue to have control is one of the great puzzles. I lived there in a time when Fidel Ramos was president, and it was a time of real wonderful prosperity for the Philippines and a lot of economic growth. At the end, there was the whole Asian crisis, and then things sort of reverted back, and you look at it and you really scratch your head. But here's the wonderful thing. In the middle of all the political turmoil, in the middle of contested elections, and those elections are remarkably contested. In some places, candidates literally are murdered. You look at all of that. In all of that, the gospel still goes forward. The Christian church is still wonderfully strong. And I look to our current political turmoil, and I go, well, I lived through that in the Philippines, and let's keep focused on what we need to be focused about, which is let's populate heaven. If you put all of your stock into political victories and political solutions to our problems, you will be disappointed. But if you put all of your hope in Jesus, then he will never disappoint you, and the kingdom of God will stand. Not even the gates of hell will prevail against it. So let's look to him. He's the author, the finisher of our faith. Let's do that in the Philippines. Let's do that right here in the United States.